Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping straight into the source material. You shared some really key excerpts from Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score.
A landmark book for sure.
Absolutely. And our mission for this particular deep dive is very focused. We want to unpack the core ideas in Chapter 5 based only on the text we have in front of us.
Right, and this chapter, based on what's here, it's really foundational, isn't it?
It seems that way. It lays the groundwork.
It really does. It gets into the biological, the physiological ways trauma actually impacts the brain and the body, how it reshapes things.
And understanding that seems critical.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
Because it helps explain why people experience the symptoms they do. It gives context. And it also points towards, treatments that might actually work because they address these deeper levels.
It's not just in the mind, then.
Not at all. It's in the living, breathing, sensing organism. That's the core message here.
Okay, let's get into it. Chapter 5. The text starts with something pretty fundamental about the brain's, well, its main goal.
Yeah, it's number one priority.
Which is?
Survival. Simple as that.
To survival.
Yep.
Yeah.
Even when things are absolutely miserable, the brain's prime directive is just keep the organism alive. Everything else comes second. Learning, connecting. All secondary to staying alive.
That sounds obvious, but framing it as the absolute top priority, it does shift how you think about brain function, doesn't it?
It really does. It reframes a lot of psychological issues.
So, okay, survival first. What does a brain actually need to do to make that happen? The source lists some key functions.
Right. There are 5 essential things mentioned. First, it needs to generate internal signals, what the body needs.
Like hunger, thirst, rest.
Exactly. Food, rest, protection, shelter, even sex sometimes. The basic demands.
The body telling the brain what's needed.
Precisely. Second, it has to build a map of the world outside. Where can I find food? Where's the danger? Where's shelter?
Mental map to navigate.
Third, it needs to generate the energy and then coordinate the actions to use that map to go get those needs met.
Okay, so sense the need, map the world, act in the world.
You got it.
Yeah.
Fourth, it has to constantly be warning us. Dangers, but also opportunities. Real-time updates.
Is that noise a threat? Is this person friendly? That kind of thing.
Exactly that. And fifth, crucially, it needs to adjust our actions based on what's happening right now. Flexibility. Adapting moment to moment.
That adaptability seems key.
It's vital. And for creatures like us, mammals who often live in groups, the text adds another layer.
Which is?
The ability to coordinate and collaborate with others. We often survive better together.
Right. Social connection as a survival strategy.
Absolutely. And here's the critical link Chapter 5 makes, according to the text. Psychological problems often happen when one or more of these essential functions breaks down.
How so? Give me an example.
Well, maybe your internal signals fail. You don't feel hungry when you need food, or you don't recognize you're exhausted, or your map of the world gets distorted. You see threats everywhere.
Or you feel paralyzed, unable to act.
That too. Or your actions don't actually match what you need. Or maybe your ability to connect with others, to collaborate, just collapses.
And the source is explicit? Trauma can mess with every single one of these core survival functions.
Every single one. It's systemic. You mentioned Tom from the book earlier, feeling numb.
Yeah, emotionally frozen.
That's a breakdown in internal signals about his feelings, his needs, right? And that impacts his relationships. A breakdown in coordination, collaboration with his family. It all interconnects.
Okay, so that's the brain's core job and how trauma disrupts it. What about the immediate response to threat? The text talks about that being very automatic.
Oh, incredibly automatic. Almost unsettlingly so. When the brain's alarm system thinks smoke detector goes off, the older, more primitive parts just kick in.
The reptilian brain stuff.
Exactly. Those parts trigger pre-programmed physical escape plans. It's hardwired.
Hardwired directly to the body.
Yes, a direct line. Nerves, chemicals. The basic brain structures are intimately connected to the body's response systems. When danger is sensed, this old brain effectively takes the wheel.
And the conscious mind, the thinking part.
It gets partially sidelined, according to the text. The old brain takes over to propel the body into action.
The classic fight, flight.
Or freeze. Run, hide, fight. Or if none of those seem possible, freeze. Shut down.
And this can happen before you're even consciously aware of the decision.
That's a really key point in the text. Your body might already be moving, reacting, before your higher brain, your conscious self, has fully processed what is happening or why. Survival speed.
Wow. So the body leads.
In those moments, often yes. The goal, ideally, if the response works and the danger passes, is that you recover. You find your internal balance again, you regain your senses, as the text puts it.
But with trauma,
That return to equilibrium is often broken. The system doesn't reset properly. Like the veterans mentioned who only felt truly alive when replaying the trauma, it suggests that feeling safe and balanced in the present becomes incredibly difficult.
this leads us to the emotional brain, right? The text talks about that concept.
It does. It's described as the combination of that reptilian brain and the limbic system. Think of it as the central hub.
Right at the core of the nervous system.
Yep. And its main job, according to this chapter, is constantly scanning your environment, both internal and external, for anything important to your welfare.
Looking out for you, basically.
Looking out for you. And crucially, it's not just spotting danger.
What else?
It's also looking for opportunities. Anything significant. The text gives the example of, say, meeting a potential partner who seems promising. That's significant too.
So threats and opportunities, and when it spots something.
It sends out an alert, like an internal alarm bell.
And how does that alert feel? Is it a thought?
Not primarily. The alert comes through the body. It triggers hormone releases that create visceral sensations.
Or feelings.
Literally. Anything from, a little bit of queasiness or butterflies in your stomach to that sudden gripping panic in your chest. Physical sensations.
And these sensations have a purpose.
Absolutely. They're designed to grab your attention, pull you away from whatever you were doing, and reorient you physically and mentally towards whatever the emotional brain flagged as important. Threat or opportunity.
It's like an internal compass that shouts directions through feelings in your body.
That's a great way to put it. And the book emphasizes just how much these sensations, even subtle ones, influence us. Our daily decisions, big and small.
Like what?
Think about it. What food appeals to you when you feel like sleeping? Who you're drawn to or repelled by? The music you like, your hobbies, who you trust, who you see as an enemy. The text suggests these are all heavily influenced, often unconsciously, by these signals from the emotional brain.
Our gut feelings really are guiding us constantly.
They are. It's a fundamental navigation system.
So this whole system depends on information coming in from the outside world, right? Eyes, ears, nose, skin.
Yes, all that sensory data streams in. And the text explains it first converges in a specific brain area. The thalamus is located deep inside the limbic system. And the book uses this brilliant analogy.
I remember this bit, the cook.
Exactly. The thalamus is like the cook, stirring all these different ingredients, sights, sounds, smells, physical sensations, into one coherent dish. An autobiographical soup.
Meaning an integrated experience.
Right. The feeling of this is what is happening to me right now, all woven together. A coherent story of the present moment.
Okay, so the thalamus integrates it. Then what?
Then the information splits and goes down two main pathways. There's the low road.
Fast track.
Super fast. The text emphasizes it goes straight to the amygdala.
The alarm system we talked about gets the warning out quickly.
Precisely. Then there's the high road. This path sends the information up to the frontal lobes.
The thinking part of the brain. Conscious awareness.
Yes, where we reflect, understand, make meaning. But this high road takes longer, several milliseconds longer than the low road.
So you get that instant unconscious alert from the low road before your conscious brain fully registers the why. Makes sense for quick reactions.
It's built for speed when survival might be on the line. But this is where trauma throws a wrench in the works.
What happens to this process during a traumatic event?
According to the source, during an overwhelming threat, that integration process in the thalamus, the cook stirring the soup, can break down. It gets overloaded.
So the soup doesn't come together.
Exactly. Instead of a coherent experience, the sensory input, the sights, sounds, smells, the physical touch gets recorded as isolated, disconnected fragments.
Dissociated fragments, not part of a story.
Just raw pieces. And the text highlights a major consequence of this breakdown.
Yes.
Time itself can feel like it freezes. Because the experience isn't integrated into a flowing timeline, the present danger feels endless, like it will last forever.
It sounds terrifying.
It is. And this fragmentation, this difficulty weaving sensory input into a coherent whole, is a big reason why the source says traumatized individuals often struggle later to decipher what's actually going on around them in the present.
Because their processor for present experience got damaged.
In a way, yes. Think of Stan in the book having a flashback. His amygdala, low road, is screaming danger and now danger, like the crash is happening again, while the part of his brain that understands time and context, high road needing thalamus input, is essentially offline or receiving fragmented data. The past overwhelms the present.
So if your basic way of understanding what's happening now is broken into pieces, it must make the present feel very confusing or threatening.
Absolutely. And the book says this fragmentation doesn't just affect perception, it also impacts imagination.
Imagination? How so?
The capacity for flexible thinking, for playfulness in the mind. The text brings up the Rorschach test, the ink blots.
Right, what do you see in the ink?
Normally, people look at those ambiguous shapes, and their imagination kicks in. They see butterflies, or faces, or landscapes. They play with possibilities.
But the traumatized veterans in the study responded differently.
Very differently, according to the text. Some couldn't see beyond their trauma. They look at an ink blot and literally see scenes from combat or specific horrific images.
So superimposing the past onto the present stimulus.
Exactly. They weren't really interpreting the blot. They were just replaying the trauma. Others, they just went blank.
Blank, as in saw nothing.
Pretty much. The text describes them saying things like, it's just a bunch of ink, or I see nothing. And this is interpreted as loss of that capacity for mental play, for imagination.
A kind of mental rigidity.
Yes. Even the ones replaying trauma scenes weren't showing flexibility. They were stuck repeating an old reel, as the book puts it, instead of creatively engaging with what was in front of them.
So trauma can literally shrink your imaginative space.
Yeah.
That's
Anapa,
quite profound.
it really shows how deep the impact goes. It narrows your whole way of engaging with the world, both internally and externally. Which brings us back to that threat detection system.
The emotional brain deciding what's safe or dangerous.
Right. Those structures make the call. And when that system is dysregulated by trauma,
What happens then?
the text suggests people can become like conditioned animals.
Yeah.
Any little thing that even vaguely resembles a past threat or just feels off can trigger the full-blown fight-or-flight response.
Even if the actual danger is minimal or non-existent.
Exactly. It's like that smoke detector example going off constantly just for making toast. The threshold is way too low. Stan's amygdala, again, always on high alert, misinterpreting neutral cues.
That sounds exhausting, living in constant high alert.
It is. But the source offers some hope here. It says this hypersensitive system can be changed. It's not fixed.
Okay, how? How can it be changed?
The text identifies two main ways to potentially modify this threat detection system. One is described as top-down.
Top-down, meaning from the thinking brain.
Yes, essentially modulating the alarm system via messages from the medial prefrontal cortex, using conscious awareness and regulation strategies to calm the lower centers.
Okay, using reason to soothe the fear.
That's the idea. The other way is bottom-up.
Working from the body upward.
Exactly. Working directly with and through the older brain structures, the body's sensations. The text specifically mentions things like breathing, movement, and touch as ways to influence the system from the bottom up.
That distinction feels really important for treatment.
It's critical.
Yeah.
It points towards very different kinds of therapeutic approaches, which we can definitely explore more later. But Chapter 5 also spells out the really difficult consequences when the brain and body go into a deeper shutdown mode.
Beyond fight or flight.
Yes, into states of numbing, depersonalization, dissociation. Tom's experience, which you mentioned, is a powerful example from the text, feeling his heart was frozen.
Living behind a glass wall, hardly recognizing himself. That sense of disconnection.
That floating in space feeling. It's profound numbing. And the book describes therapists encountering this directly in their offices.
How so?
Patients telling these absolutely horrific stories, but with no apparent feeling at all, completely flat.
That must be challenging for the therapist, too.
The text says it's incredibly draining. The therapist feels like they have to work harder, almost supply the emotional energy for the room, and sometimes just wishes the session was over because it's so hard to connect.
And Ute's brain scan is mentioned here, too.
Yes, as a stark illustration of what this blanked-out state looks like physiologically. Her scan showed the huge parts of her brain, especially areas involved in feeling, self-awareness, and thinking, were just tuned out, virtually offline.
And when the brain is offline like that, what can a person actually do?
According to the source, not much effectively. You can't think clearly, you can't feel things deeply, you struggle to access memories properly, you can't really make sense of what's happening.
Which has big implications for therapy.
Huge. The text is very direct. Conventional talk therapy in these states is pretty much useless.
Why useless?
Because the parts of the brain you need for talking, processing, feeling, integrating,
Yeah.
they're not available. They're shut down. Just talking at someone in that state isn't going to engage the systems needed for healing.
That explains why some traditional approaches might fail with severe trauma. What about dissociation? Is that part of this shutdown?
Yes, dissociation is described as a related phenomenon. It's the ability to simultaneously know something and not know it, to be detached from the reality of an experience.
How does that develop?
The text suggests it's often a learned coping mechanism, especially from early life. If caregivers consistently ignore a child's needs or are hostile or resentful, the child might learn to mentally block out the pain, the neglect, the hostility, to not feel it consciously.
That the body still knows.
Exactly. The mind detaches to cope, but the body often remains on high alert, sensing the underlying danger or lack of safety. The connection breaks.
And immobilization, being trapped.
The source states that immobilization, being physically unable to fight or flee during a threat, is at the root of most traumas. You're stuck.
What happens in the body then?
In that state of helplessness, a different part of the nervous system often takes over. The dorsal vagal complex, or DVC.
Part of the vagus nerve system.
Yes, it triggers a primitive shutdown response. Like an animal playing dead. Heart rate plummets, breathing becomes very shallow. People describe feeling zombie-like, losing touch with themselves, their surroundings.
Dissociating, fainting.
Yes, or collapsing. It's the body's last resort when escape or fighting isn't possible. And the example of Sherry picking at her skin.
Yeah, what did that illustrate?
It showed how even in that profound, numbing shutdown state, the body might crave any intense sensation, even a painful one, just to feel something, to break through the terrifying void, the blankness.
It's just to feel real again, even if it's through pain.
It seems so. When all these systems lead to senses becoming muffled, whether through numbing dissociation, the thalamus disruption, the text says people lose something fundamental. The capacity to feel fully alive.
Wow, that's a huge consequence.
It really is. The source brings in William James here, the psychologist, and his work on emotion. Specifically, a case study he wrote about involving sensory insensibility.
Sensory insensibility. What did that feel like for the person?
The description quoted is just devastating. The woman said she had no human sensations, felt a void in the front of my head. She described a diminution of sensibility, like she couldn't properly reach objects through touch, an impossibility of feeling and of any sort of enjoyment. She called it an incomprehensible torture.
Incomprehensible torture. That really conveys the horror of being so disconnected from your own body and senses.
It absolutely does. And this difficulty in sensing the body, this disconnection, is linked in the text to something called alexithymia.
Alexithymia, what does that mean?
It basically means difficulty identifying and describing one's own emotions, a lack of words for feelings.
What does that look like in practice? How does it show up?
The source gives a few examples. Someone with alexithymia might substitute action for feeling. You ask them, how would you feel if a truck was speeding towards you? Instead of saying terrified, they might just say, I'd jump out of the way.
Focusing on the practical action, not the inner experience.
Exactly. They also tend, according to the text, to experience their emotions primarily as physical symptoms.
Right.
Unexplained muscle pain, stomach problems, headaches, bowel issues. But they don't connect these physical things to underlying emotional distress. There's no physical cause found, but they don't recognize it as, say, anxiety or sadness manifesting physically.
And they struggle to find words for feelings.
Yes, difficulty describing feelings is key. And they also often have trouble reading emotions on other people's faces. That social emotional connection is impaired.
What are the broader consequences of being so out of touch with your body and emotions?
It really impacts how people respond to life's challenges. The text suggests they might lack nuance. They might flip between being completely spaced out and numb or suddenly erupting in excessive anger or rage.
Why the extremes?
Because they couldn't sense the buildup. They didn't recognize the subtle cues of rising frustration or anxiety earlier, so they couldn't manage it. It just explodes, or they shut down completely.
And the text links this lack of body awareness to some really serious outcomes, too?
It does, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It connects it to a documented lack of self-protection among trauma survivors, tragically high rates of re-victimization, and profound difficulties in experiencing pleasure, sensuality, connection, and finding meaning or vitality in life.
It all circles back to that fundamental disconnect from the felt sense of being alive in your own skin.
Precisely. It underscores how central the body is to our entire experience of self and world.
We're really getting into the weeds here, unpacking the mechanics. It's complex, but so important.
Understanding these biological and physiological shifts is absolutely the key, according to this text, to figuring out how to help people truly heal, not just cope.
Okay, this feels like a good moment to just check in with you listening. If you're finding this deep dive into Chapter 5 valuable, if it's sparking some understanding for you, we'd really appreciate it if you could take a second to click the like button.
It genuinely helps us know we're on the right track and helps other people find these discussions.
And if you like this kind of detailed exploration and want more deep dives like this, looking at different aspects of trauma and healing based on key texts, please do subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss out on future content.
Thanks for considering that. So picking back up, the chapter then introduces Steve Porges and his polyvagal theory. This adds another important layer.
Right. Porges had this insight about our baseline state as mammals, didn't he?
He did. He proposed that our default state isn't actually total relaxation. It's more like a state of mild readiness, slight vigilance.
Always a little bit on guard.
Sort of. A low-level preparedness for potential danger. It's adaptive. But, and this is the crucial part Porges highlighted, for us to engage in close, trusting connection with another person.
What needs to happen?
That default defensive system needs to temporarily stand down. It has to be inhibited.
You have to lower your guard to really connect.
You got it. The brain needs to feel safe enough to switch off that baseline vigilance so that what Porges calls the social engagement system can come online. That's the system for connection, play, intimacy, nurturing.
And how can that shift happen, especially if someone's system is stuck in defense mode due to trauma?
Well, the text mentions Porges's work, suggesting that things like rhythmically attuned movements can help.
Rhythmic movement? Like what?
Simple things, often done together. The examples given are like helping arrange chairs in a clinic setting together in a steady rhythm, or people joining in, tapping at a musical beat together.
Synchronized, safe, physical activity.
Exactly. These kinds of activities can apparently help regulate the nervous system, create a small island of safety, and allow that social engagement system to tentatively reemerge. It's a bottom-up way of signaling safety.
And the chapter also emphasizes very basic cues like tone of voice.
Hugely important. The text describes tone of voice as a fundamental biological cue for safety or danger. We are wired to respond instantly.
How so?
Harsh, critical, angry tones automatically trigger defensive responses in us. Fear, withdrawal, anger, shutdown. We can't help it. Conversely, playful, warm, soothing tones signal safety. They allow us to open up, relax, feel more connected.
It shows how much our physiology is constantly reacting to the social environment, doesn't it? Even subtle cues.
Constantly. Our nervous systems are in dialogue with each other all the time, whether we realize it or not.
Okay, so all this understanding, the brain changes, the body responses, the shutdown, the polyvagal states, it all leads back to the challenge of healing. And the book stresses it's not just about the past.
No, that's a really key point. The text says the challenge isn't solely resolving past events. It's fundamentally about enhancing the quality of a person's day-to-day experience right now.
Helping them feel more alive in the present.
Exactly. And it offers an explanation for why traumatic memories can become so dominant and intrusive for people struggling with PTSD.
Why is that? Why do they get stuck there?
Often the text suggests it's because feeling truly alive, engaged, and safe in the present moment is so incredibly difficult for them. The here and now might feel numb or disconnected or vaguely threatening.
So the mind goes somewhere else.
It gravitates towards where it did feel intense sensation, where things felt vividly real. Paradoxically, even if that place was filled with horror and misery, the traumatic past can feel more intensely alive than a muted, dissociated present.
That's a disturbing paradox, drawn back to the horror because the present feels like nothing.
Or feels unsafe in a less defined way. So the goal of treatment shouldn't just be to make the past less painful.
But to make the present more vibrant, more accessible, more compelling.
Precisely. Treatment needs to help people live more fully and securely now. And the way to do that, according to the text, is by bringing those brain structures that got knocked offline during the trauma back into integrated functioning, helping the whole system work together again.
And the book contrasts this with approaches that maybe focus too much on just desensitization.
It does draw that contrast. It argues that while desensitizing someone to a traumatic memory might make them less reactive when they think about it, that alone doesn't necessarily help them find joy or satisfaction in ordinary life.
Why not?
Because if you still can't feel fully present in your body, connected to your senses, engaged with the world around you right now, then things like enjoying a walk or tasting food or playing with kids might still feel flat or distant. Desensitization doesn't automatically restore that capacity for embodied presence.
It brings it all back to that core need to inhabit your body and senses safely, which Chapter 5 shows is so fundamentally disrupted by trauma.
Exactly. And this deep understanding of how trauma registers in the body and its connection to things like the vagus nerve system that Porges talks about provides a direct rationale for treatments that work from the bottom up.
Using the body to regulate the brain.
That's the idea. The source highlights a fascinating statistic that about 80% of the fibers in the vagus nerve are afferent.
Afferent meaning?
Meaning they carry signals from the body up to the brain, not the other way around.
So the body is constantly talking to the brain via this huge nerve highway.
A massive amount of information flow upwards. And this is powerful because it means that things we do with our body, specific ways of breathing, chanting, specific kinds of movement, can directly influence and train our arousal system. They send messages up the vagus nerve to help regulate brain function.
These are often techniques found in really ancient practices, aren't they? Yoga, meditation, chanting.
Exactly. Practices that have been around for millennia, intuitively understanding this body-brain connection, but sometimes viewed as alternative or fringe in mainstream Western medicine.
Which seems odd, given the physiological basis Chapter 5 outlines.
It does. And the text contrasts these bottom-up approaches with the more common mainstream focus, particularly in psychiatry, on using medication.
Using drugs to manage the symptoms, like being hyper-aroused or shut down.
Right. And while the text acknowledges medications can sometimes be helpful as adjuncts, as part of a broader plan, it implies they are often over-relied upon, perhaps instead of helping people learn to fundamentally regulate their own physiology.
So instead of just trying to chemically dampen the alarm bells?
The goal should involve learning how to understand and work with the body's signals.
Oh.
The source is really clear on this. The very first step to recovery is learning to sense, name, and identify what is going on inside your own body.
Becoming aware of those internal sensations we talked about earlier.
Yes, gaining some mastery over those sensations, whether they're overwhelming or terrifyingly absent. That's step one.
How does one practice that?
Mindfulness is mentioned as crucial. Learning to observe your physical reactions, the racing heart, the tight chest, the shaky hands, with a sense of calm curiosity, without immediately reacting or shutting down.
Just noticing.
Just noticing. This practice, the text says, helps calm the sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight response. And importantly, learning to observe and tolerate these physical sensations is actually described as a prerequisite for safely going back to process traumatic memories.
Why a prerequisite?
Because you need to be anchored in your present bodily experience. You need some capacity to tolerate physical intensity without getting completely overwhelmed or re-traumatized. If you can stay grounded in your body now, you have a safer platform from which to touch upon the intense sensations of the past.
That makes a lot of sense. You need a safe base in the present to explore the past.
Exactly. And this loops back to the text's critique of how mainstream trauma treatment has sometimes fallen short.
In what way?
By paying, as the source puts it, scant attention to actually helping deeply terrified people learn how to safely experience their own physical sensations and emotions.
Focusing more on the story or the diagnosis, maybe. Or medication.
Perhaps, instead of prioritizing helping people reconnect with and manage their own sensory world, which Chapter 5 argues is absolutely fundamental, because that's where the trauma is held.
Okay, so if we were to really boil down the core contribution of Chapter 5, based on these excerpts, what would it be?
I think it's providing that absolutely vital foundational understanding that trauma isn't just a mental event. It's not just bad memories. It fundamentally alters the brain's basic survival architecture and deeply changes the body's ongoing physiological responses.
It gives us the why behind the symptoms.
Exactly. It explains the biological basis for things like numbing, dissociation, feeling disconnected from your body, having a skewed threat perception, even the impacts on imagination that seems puzzling otherwise.
And the big takeaway for healing.
Because trauma is so deeply embodied, effective treatment must address the body. It has to involve working with these physiological systems, helping them regulate and integrate, not just talking about the past narrative. It shifts the whole frame.
From what's wrong with your thinking to what happened to your core survival systems and how can we help them come back online and work together again.
That captures it perfectly. It's a paradigm shift, really.
We've definitely gone deep today, really exploring the nuts and bolts of how trauma impacts the brain and body according to this chapter. It lays crucial groundwork.
It really does. It's a powerful reminder of how interconnected our minds, brains, and bodies truly are.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought for you to maybe mull over, something sparked by this discussion. Given everything we've talked about, how trauma impacts our physical experience, our breathing, our sense of presence, those deep brain systems consider how seemingly simple practices might connect to all this complexity.
Simple practices
Like just pausing occasionally during your day to consciously notice the rhythm of your breath for a minute or two, or intentionally feeling the sensation of your feet making contact with the floor. How might these very basic acts of attention be a gentle way to start communicating safety back to those deeper systems? A small step towards feeling more present, more grounded, maybe even a little more in control.
just noticing the physical reality of the present moment. Something to perhaps experiment with, gently.
Definitely something to reflect on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Chapter 5 of The Body Keeps the Score. Understanding this foundation is so important.
And necessary for figuring out what comes next in terms of healing. We'll certainly explore how these insights shape different treatment approaches in future deep dives.
Absolutely. You can find more deep dives like this one wherever you usually get your podcasts or audio content. And one last time, if you found this exploration valuable today, if it gave you some useful insights, please do take that moment to click the like button.
It really does help other people discover this material.
And to make sure you catch our future deep dives, where we'll build on this understanding, please hit that subscribe button.
We appreciate you tuning in. Until next time.